There are nights that do not end the way they begin. There are nights that start as one thing and become something else entirely before the sun comes up, and the people who live through them are never quite the same on the other side. Christmas Eve of 1886 was that kind of night in the valley of Greystone, Colorado. It was the kind of night that separated what a man believed about himself from what he actually was. Ward Heston had believed many things about himself for 47 years. He believed he was a practical man, a man who understood weather and land and livestock and the particular arithmetic of survival in high country. He had built the biggest cattle ranch in the valley with his own hands, and the force of his own certainty and that certainty had never failed him, not once. Not in 23 years of Colorado winters, not in drought years or lean years, or the years when the silver market collapsed and half the men he knew went broke. He was not broke. He was never wrong. And he had told himself and anyone who would listen that this winter was going to be mild. He had said it in October when the aspen trees turned gold 2 weeks early. He had said it in November when the elk moved down from the high meadows ahead of schedule and the squirrels stripped the pine cones with a frenzy that should have meant something. He had said it in December when the temperature climbed back above freezing and the snow that had accumulated melted away and people in Greystone breathed easy and stopped worrying. He had said it that very morning, Christmas Eve morning, when his wife Miriam asked him if they had enough firewood stacked against the north wall. Plenty, he had said. More than plenty. This winter is going to be mild. I can feel it in my bones. He knew on his hands and knees in the snow that night with his son Daniel, unconscious on his back, and the temperature somewhere past 40 degrees below zero, that he had been catastrophically, completely, irreversibly wrong. His bones had lied to him. The cold that night was not the cold of ordinary Wyoming winters. It was not the cold of a bad week or a hard snap that lasted a few days and broke. It was a different kind of cold altogether. A cold with intention behind it. A cold that had been organizing itself over the mountains for weeks. While the people of Greystone told each other everything was fine, it came all at once on Christmas Eve like something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment. And when it came at 60 miles an hour from the northwest. And it dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 2 hours, and it did not stop. The chimney at the Heston Ranch house was encased in ice before midnight. Ward had gone outside with a shovel to break it loose, and the wind had knocked him flat twice before he made it 10 feet from the door. His hands went numb before he reached the chimney. When he finally got there, the ice was inches thick and solid as iron, and the wind was driving snow horizontally into his face, and he could not feel his fingers anymore. And he understood with a clarity that only genuine terror provides, that he was going to lose this fight. He went back inside. Daniel was on the bed, 5 years old, the smallest of his 3 children, a boy who had never been seriously ill a day in his life, a boy who ran everywhere he went and laughed too loud and asked questions faster than any adult could answer them. Daniel was not running anywhere now. Daniel was lying on the bed with his lips turning a color that Ward had seen once before, on a man pulled from a frozen river, a deep purplish blue that meant the body was losing its argument with the cold, that the blood was retreating to the core to protect the organs it considered essential and abandoning everything else. Miriam was at the bedside with her hands over her mouth. Smoke hung in the air of the front room. The fire had been guttering and dying for 2 hours, starved of oxygen by the sealed chimney, filling the house with the kind of air that made children cough, and then made them stop coughing because their lungs gave up. Ward Heston stood in the middle of his house, the house he had built with his own hands, the house with the good timber walls and the tight roof and the chimney. He had laid stone by stone 15 years ago, and he had no answer. He had always had an answer. For 23 years in this valley, he had always known what to do next. And now his son was dying on the bed, and the chimney was sealed with ice, and the storm was stronger than anything he had ever prepared for, because he had never prepared at all. He put Daniel on his back. He did not think about it. He did not weigh the options or calculate the odds. He put his boy on his back, and he wrapped every blanket in the house around the small, still body, and he told Miriam to get the other children dressed in everything they owned, and he opened the door into the howling white wall of the storm, and he walked into it. The wind hit him like a physical thing, like a wall of frozen iron moving at the speed of a freight train. It stole the breath from his mouth before he could draw it back. It found the gap between his collar and his scarf and drove needles of ice against the skin of his neck. The snow was not falling. It was flying sideways, driven so hard, it was indistinguishable from the wind itself, and it reduced visibility to nothing, not to 10 feet or 5 feet, to nothing. The world ended at arm's length in every direction. He knew the road. He had walked it 1,000 times. He could not see it. He walked on memory and on the bone-deep animal terror of a father carrying a dying child. And he walked because stopping was the same as surrendering. And he was not going to surrender while Daniel was still breathing. The boy was barely breathing. Ward fell the first time at the quarter-mile mark, going down face first into snow that reached his waist. Daniel sliding off his back, and he grabbed the boy and got him back up and stood and kept moving. He fell again 50 yards further, going down on one knee, and the knee told him clearly and specifically that it did not want to straighten again. He straightened it anyway. He kept moving. Then, through the white chaos, he saw it. At first, he thought his frozen brain was showing him what it wanted to see. He thought it was a hallucination, produced by cold and desperation, and the particular cruelty of a mind that gives you hope as a consolation prize right before the end. But he stumbled toward it anyway because there was nothing else to stumble toward. It grew more distinct as he closed the distance. Not a light in a window, not the glow of a fire through curtains, a thin line of gold around the edges of a door set into the face of a rock cliff, a door that someone had built there, had framed with heavy timber and fitted with thick oak, a door that he had ridden past on the bluff road for 6 months and noticed only long enough to shake his head. He raised one hand and beat it against the wood. The wind swallowed the sound. He beat again. A voice from inside muffled through 4 inches of oak. "Who is it?" Another voice he recognized. The sheriff, Birch Hadley, who had come out into the storm to find people who needed finding. Ward Heston. He has the boy. The boy is not right. Silence. A silence that stretched and thinned like something being pulled past its limit. A silence in which Ward Heston understood completely for the first time in his life what it felt like to have no power at all, to have nothing, to be on your knees in the snow with a dying child on your back, and no answer, and nowhere left to go, except the door of the woman he had spent 6 months calling a fool. The bar lifted from its brackets on the other side. The door swung inward. Light poured out like something liquid. And in that light stood a woman, not tall, hair the color of winter wheat gone silver, pulled back from a face that showed no surprise, no anger, no satisfaction. She looked at the man on his knees. She looked at the child on his back. She looked at the fear written across every frozen inch of his face, and she stepped aside. "Get in," she said. "All of you." 2 words, that is all she said. And in the life of Ward Heston, those 2 words were the most expensive thing he had ever received, because he knew exactly what they cost the woman who said them, and he knew he had done nothing to deserve them. But to understand why those 2 words cost what they did, you have to go back. Back to the summer. Back to a room that smelled of coal dust and the particular heaviness of air that has been breathed by a dying man for too many weeks. Back to the beginning. Silas Callum had been a strong man. That was the first thing anyone who knew him said when they tried to describe him, not strong in the way of men who lift heavy things for show, but strong in the way of a man who has worked underground for 30 years and learned that the earth does not give you anything without a fight. He was built close to the ground, wide across the shoulders, with hands that were more scar than skin, and eyes that had spent so long adjusting to darkness that they had a quality of patience in them, even in full sunlight. He had come to Colorado with his father as a boy of 12, following a vein of silver into the mountains, the way his family had followed veins of tin in Cornwall for generations before that. His grandfather, Edgar, had worked the tin mines of Cornwall and survived things that broke other men. Not because he was lucky, but because he understood something that most people above ground never learned. The earth below the frost line holds a steady temperature regardless of what is happening on the surface. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer and winter, blizzard and calm. Not warm by any comfortable standard, but warm enough to keep a body alive if you could keep the wind out and the air moving. Edgar had passed that knowledge to his son William. William had brought it to Colorado and passed it to Silas. And Silas had carried it the way you carry things that have never yet been kneaded carefully, in the back of his mind, waiting for the moment it would matter. He had never expected the moment to arrive the way it did. In the spring of 1882, a tunnel in the Greystone silver mine collapsed without warning. 2 men died instantly under the rock. Silas Callum survived. He survived pinned in a pocket of air, barely large enough to sit upright in breathing stone dust for 4 days and 4 nights, while the rescue team dug toward him. They pulled him out alive, and the town celebrated. But the celebrating was premature. The dust had settled in his lungs, and over the next 4 years, it quietly and methodically destroyed them. By the autumn of 1886, getting out of bed exhausted him. Speaking more than a few sentences left him gasping. He knew what was coming. He had known for months. And Silas Callum spent the last weeks of his life not saying goodbye. He spent them drawing. He made Nora bring him paper and a pencil. His hands shook so badly that his handwriting was nearly impossible to read. But the numbers were precise. They were precise because they were not his invention. They were 3 generations of knowledge passed from Cornwall to Colorado, from grandfather to father to son. Knowledge about what the earth held steady and what the wind could not reach, and what the difference between a cold that killed and a cold that could be survived came down to in the end. He drew a cave. Not a hypothetical cave, a specific one. A cave in the bluff a mile outside Greystone that he had found years earlier, when he was still healthy enough to ride the high trails. The cave faced southeast, which meant morning sun could warm the entrance. The north wall of the bluff shielded it from the northwest wind that brought the worst winter storms. The ceiling rose 14 feet with natural cracks in the rock that would serve as ventilation. The cave ran 40 feet deep into the mountain, narrowing toward the back where the earth held its temperature most stable. He drew walls lined with timber and packed with clay and straw. He drew a cast-iron stove positioned in the main living area, with a pipe running to a natural fissure in the ceiling. He drew a sleeping chamber in the deepest part of the cave, He drew a door of thick oak opening inward, because he knew snow would pile against an outward opening door and seal you inside. But an inward opening door let you push through from the other side, let you break through a wall of snow with the leverage of your own body. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that shook with the effort of every letter he wrote for 50 bodies minimum, "Promise me, Nora." Nora had looked at that number for a long time before she asked him why. He looked at her with those patient, dark, adjusted eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Because when the real winter comes, it will not just be us who need shelter. The whole town will come to you, and you will let them in." His hand found hers. His grip was weaker than it had been, but his voice was not. "Promise me," he said. "Do not trust wooden walls. Do not trust what everyone believes, because it has always been true before. Trust what the earth teaches. Trust what my father taught me." She promised. She promised him on a Thursday afternoon in October, with the last of the autumn light coming through the window and his breathing so shallow she had to watch his chest to be sure it was moving. She promised him, and she meant it with everything she had. 3 weeks later, Silas Callum drew one final shallow breath and let it go. Her hand was in his. His eyes were on hers. And the silence that followed was the loudest sound Nora had ever heard in 64 years of living. She buried him on the hill above the valley where the morning light was good and the wind was gentle. She stood at the grave until the gravediggers were done and the other mourners had gone home. She stood there alone in the early November cold, and she looked at the mound of raw earth, and she said out loud to no one and to him at the same time, "I will keep it." Then she went home and opened the Calloway family Bible to the back cover, where she had pressed Silas's drawings flat against the end paper, and she began to plan. By May of the following year, she had started building. The cave was a mile up the bluff road, past the point where the wagon track turned to nothing more than a suggestion in the rock. Nora drove the supply wagon up that road every morning before the sun was full up, the 2 children still sleeping in the small lean-to she had built near the cave mouth to shelter them while the work was underway. Clem, 14 years old, slept with his back to the wall and his face turned away from her, in the particular posture of a boy who was angry about things he could not yet name. Retta, 9 years old, slept on her back with one hand resting on the copper-colored fur of the dog Silas had given them 2 years before the mine collapse, as though she was reassuring the animal, or the animal was reassuring her, or perhaps both of those things were true at once. The dog was named Copper, and he had been a puppy when Silas brought him home a small, ridiculous ball of gold-red fur that Silas had pressed into Retta's arms and said was for the whole family, but was clearly for Retta. The dog was 5 years old now. He had Silas's same quality of patient attention, the quality of something that had learned to wait without giving up. And sometimes when Nora looked at him, she felt the particular ache of recognition that comes from seeing something of a lost person in something still living. She worked every day. She worked until the light failed, and her hands could not grip the tools, and her shoulders had said everything they had to say about the day's labor. She felled trees in the ravine below the bluff, small scrub pines straight enough for her purposes, and she moved them using the method she had read about in a book she had used to teach children the method of rollers. 2 small branch lengths placed perpendicular under the log so that she could push it forward rather than lift it, relying on the slope of the land rather than on the strength of hands that had been slowing down for the past 3 years. Her knuckles were swollen every morning when she woke. That was the arthritis. It had been working its way into her hands for 5 years, and it had opinions about cold mornings, and about gripping axe handles, and about everything else she was doing out here. She wrapped her hands with strips of cloth before she started, and she changed the grip angle, and she used her body weight in ways she had worked out by trial and error over the first difficult weeks. And she found that the arthritis was less a barrier than it was a reminder to think before she forced. She mixed clay and dried grass and straw into a plaster that she pressed into the cave walls layer by layer. The mixture dried to the consistency of old stone and trapped air inside it. Thousands of tiny pockets, still and quiet, each one holding warmth the way a down quilt held warmth. Her hands bled into the clay sometimes. The clay dried with her blood in it and became part of the wall, and she thought that was fitting, that the wall should hold some part of her. On the first Tuesday of June, she drove the wagon into Greystone for supplies. Nails, iron fittings, a length of rope, 2 sacks of clay powder. She tied the horse outside Pruitt's general store and carried Silas's drawings inside and set them on the counter. Amos Pruitt was 51 years old and had run the general store for 16 years, and had developed over those 16 years the particular confidence of a man who knew what things were worth and what they were not worth. He looked at the drawings the way a doctor looks at a patient he has already diagnosed. He looked at Nora, 64 years old, silver-haired, standing on the other side of his counter, with her clay-stained hands flat on the wood. He told her gently and then less gently that what she was proposing was not practical, that caves were damp and dark and not suitable for human habitation, that she would be better served putting her money toward a sturdier cabin, that he was telling her this for her own benefit. Nora listened to all of it. She let him finish. Then she asked for the nails. At the back of the store in the chair he occupied most mornings before riding out to his ranch. Ward Heston looked up from his coffee. He was a large man who occupied space the way certain men did, as though he had calculated exactly how much room he was entitled to, and had taken it. He had arrived in Greystone with nothing at 24, and had built the biggest cattle operation in the valley through 23 years of hard work and harder decisions, and the unbroken record of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything important. That unbroken record had done something to him. It had turned ordinary confidence into something heavier, something that no longer questioned itself, something that looked at a 64-year-old widow with clay on her hands, building a shelter in a cave, and saw not a plan, but a symptom. He made the comment to the 2 men sharing his table not quietly, a woman her age building a house in a hole in the rock. He shook his head slowly with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a mistake being made. I will put $10 on her giving up before the first snow. Laughter at the table, wallets coming out. The beginning of something that would grow over the following weeks into a betting pool that was by September the most active ongoing wager in the history of the Greystone Saloon. Nora heard him. She heard every word. She picked up her nails and her iron fittings and her rope, and she walked out of Pruitt's general store without looking at Ward Heston. She loaded her wagon, and she drove back up the bluff road, and she worked until the light failed. She did not think about what he had said, or rather, she thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to get back to the cave, and then she put it away in the place where she put things that were not useful, and she picked up her axe and went to work. The days had their own momentum by this point. She rose before dawn, made a small fire in the lean-to, cooked something for the children. She checked the cave, which had begun to feel less like a construction site and more like a space being revealed, as though the work was not building something new, but uncovering something that had already been there, waiting. She wrapped her hands. She worked. One morning in late June, She looked up from the wall she was plastering and found an old woman standing at the cave entrance watching her. Edna Morse was 72 years old. She had arrived in Greystone before the silver boom, before the cattle ranches, before the town was anything more than a handful of tents around a creek crossing. She had buried 2 husbands here and raised children here and watched the town grow from something desperate into something that thought it was permanent. She had also survived the winter of 1856, and that survival had left a mark on her that 30 years had not smoothed. She did not come inside. She stood in the entrance and looked at the walls and the timber and the stacked firewood and the cast iron stove that Nora had hauled up the bluff road in 3 separate trips. She looked for a long time without speaking. Then she said, 37 people died that winter. I survived because 6 of us crawled into an abandoned mine shaft and stayed there for 11 days. The earth kept us alive when everything above ground was dying. She paused. The wind moved through the pine trees below the bluff. You know something this town has chosen to forget. Edna Morse said, Your husband knew it too, I imagine. My husband's grandfather survived the tin mines of Cornwall the same way Nora said. He passed the knowledge down. 3 generations of it. The old woman nodded slowly. They will keep laughing until the wind comes. I know. When it comes, she said, you will have what you need. She turned to go. Then she stopped and said one more thing without turning back. He must have loved you something fierce to spend his last strength making sure you knew what to do after he was gone. Nora set down her trowel. She stood in the cave and held those words and said nothing because there was nothing to say to a truth that large. Edna Morse walked back to her buggy and drove away down the bluff road and did not come back. She had said what she had come to say. That was enough. Clem was a problem and not a problem. He was 14 years old, and at 14 years old, the worst possible thing in the world was to be the boy whose grandmother was doing something that made other boys laugh. He helped when he was asked, but his resentment was visible in everything about him, in the way he set tools down instead of placing them, in the way he looked toward town, in the afternoons, in the way he answered questions with one word when one word was enough, and with silence when it was not. He was tall for his age and had Silas's dark eyes and Nora's jaw, which was to say, he had the jaw of a woman who had never in her life surrendered a position she had decided on. The jaw looked different. On a 14-year-old boy looked more like stubbornness than resolve, but the underlying material was the same. He came home one afternoon in July with a split lip and blood on the knuckles of his right hand, and he would not look at her when he told her about it. The Heston boys, he said. They said things. She did not ask him what things. She could imagine well enough. Did you change their minds, she said. Silence. Which was the answer? You never change a mind with your fists, Clem. You change it with time and results. He made a sound that meant he was 14 and she was wrong and he knew better. Then he said the thing that had been building in him since May, the thing that had been sitting behind his ribs getting heavier every week. The question that was not really a question. Why can we not just be normal, he said. Why does it have to be this? Nora looked at him for a moment. She put down the trowel she was holding and she walked to the saddlebag that hung on a nail near the lean-to entrance, and she took out the family Bible and she carried it back to where he was standing, and she opened it to the back cover, and she took out the paper pressed flat against the end paper. She held it out to him. Your grandfather drew this 2 months before he died, she said. When he could not walk 20 feet without stopping to breathe. When the effort of getting out of bed in the morning used up half of what he had left for the day. He used what remained to make sure we knew exactly what to do when the time came. Clem looked at the paper, The handwriting was shaking in a way that told you everything about the state of the hands that had made it. But the numbers were something else entirely. The numbers had a precision to them that belonged to a different register than the trembling letters, a precision that said the mind behind them had been completely clear and completely purposeful, even as the body that housed it was shutting down. He did this for us, Nora said. He did it so that we would be ready, not just us. He wrote something at the bottom of the page. Clem looked at the bottom of the page. For 50 bodies minimum. He looked up at her. He knew that this winter, the real one when it came, people would need somewhere to go. He knew that we would be the ones who had it ready. She folded the paper carefully and put it back in the Bible. He spent the last of himself on this Clem, not on goodbyes, on this. The boy stood there for a moment that was longer than it seemed. He looked at the cave entrance, at the walls that were going up inside at the stove, and the firewood and the doorframe that was not yet hung. He looked at his grandmother's hands, which were clay-stained and wrapped in strips of cloth, and which had been doing this every single day since May, with no one helping her, except a 14-year-old boy who had been doing it badly. He picked up a shovel. He did not say anything. He just picked up the shovel and walked past her toward the section of floor she had been leveling that morning. And he started digging, and he kept at it until the light failed, and there was nothing more to see by. July moved into August. August moved into September. The aspen trees across the valley turned gold 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the elk moved down from the high meadows earlier than anyone could remember, and the squirrels worked the pine cones with something close to panic. Most of the town either didn't notice these things or noticed them and explained them away. Nora noticed. She stood outside the cave each evening and watched the sunset, and what she saw in the sky made her work faster every morning. There was a color at the edges of the light that did not belong to any ordinary autumn. A yellowish cast like the color of old bruises, like something sick moving through the atmosphere. Silas had described it to her once, reading from his father's notes in the weeks before he got too weak to hold the pages. The sky goes wrong before a killing winter, he had said. Yellow at the edges like the light itself knows what is coming. She was seeing it now, every evening, growing stronger. She counted her firewood. She needed more. There is a moment in the building of any large thing when you realize the hardest part is not the physical labor. The physical labor is hard. 64 years old, arthritic hands working alone most of the time, moving logs and mixing clay and lifting stones. That is hard. But the hardest part is the doubt that comes in the small hours of the night when the work is not there to occupy your hands. When you lie in the lean-to listening to the wind and asking yourself whether the thing you are building is real, or whether it is grief wearing the costume of reason. Nora had those nights. She had them more than she would ever tell anyone. She would lie in the dark with the Bible on her chest and the sound of the children breathing around her, and she would open the Bible in the darkness, not to read, just to touch the paper Silas had touched. And she would feel the doubt like a cold thing pressing against the walls of her chest. Then she would do what she always did. She would think about the numbers, not the words, the numbers. The precise measurements, the calculated angles, the ratios and temperatures that a delirious dying man could not have produced, because precision of that order required clarity of mind. Silas had been dying when he made those drawings. He had not been confused. The numbers said so. Numbers do not lie. Numbers either add up or they do not. And these added up to the last decimal place. She would close the Bible and she would sleep and she would wake before dawn. And she would go back to work. The cave took shape through the summer and into the fall. The walls went up smooth and solid. The stove was positioned, and the pipe ran up through the natural fissure in the rock ceiling, drawing perfectly. The two rooms were partitioned, the sleeping room deep in the rock where the temperature held at 54 degrees summer, and winter without any fire at all, and the main room near the entrance where the stove would warm the air and light could reach from outside. And in the center of the main room, the wide open space, room for 50 people, maybe more if they pressed together. Nora had not told anyone about that part. Some things were easier to explain after the fact. In early September, she drove down to Pruitt's to buy a second order of nails. Amos Pruitt looked at her across the counter and said that his conscience would not allow him to continue selling her materials for something he considered a waste of her family's resources. That he was saying this for her own good. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said nothing. She turned and walked out and drove 12 miles to the next town and bought the nails there, losing an entire day of work. She added the day to her schedule and kept going. She never mentioned it to anyone. She never complained about it. She simply dealt with it and moved forward because dealing with it and moving forward was the only option available to a woman who had made a promise to a dying man and intended to keep it. In October, with the cave nearly complete, she was plastering the upper section of the back wall from a temporary scaffold, 2 planks laid across stacked stones. When the plank shifted, she reached too far. She felt the scaffold move, and she grabbed for the wall and caught nothing. She fell 8 feet. She landed on her left shoulder on the cave floor, and the pain was immediate and total, and specific in the way of serious injuries. The kind of pain that removes your awareness of everything else for a moment, that you cannot measure. She lay on the ground in the dim light of the cave alone, breathing through it. Copper found her first. The dog came from wherever he had been sleeping and put his face against hers and made a sound low in his throat, and then turned and barked in the direction of the lean-to until Clem came running. The boy knelt beside her. He looked at her face and at the way she was holding her arm, and something shifted in him. The resentment fell away. The embarrassment fell away. Everything that was 14 years old fell away, and what was left was simply a boy who loved his grandmother and whose grandmother was hurt. He bound her shoulder with cloth torn from a shirt using a knot. His grandfather had taught him years ago when Silas still had the breath to teach. His hands were steady. His knots were tight. When he was done, he did not ask what she wanted him to do. He asked what she needed. "Tell me what needs finishing," he said. "I will finish it." The door was the most important thing. 4 inches of solid oak on iron hinges ordered from Denver, and it had to open inward. Clem followed the drawings exactly, working from the notes his grandfather had left, asking Nora to explain the calculations when he did not understand them, which was often, and listening to the explanations with the focused attention of a boy who had stopped being embarrassed and started paying attention. He hung the door on a Saturday afternoon in late October. He pushed it closed, and they both stood inside and listened to the sound the cave made when it was sealed, which was no sound at all. The wind, which had been a constant presence in the lean-to and outside, and in the upper reaches of the cave where the entrance was still open, was simply gone. The air was still and steady, and the temperature was different from anything outside. Clem stood with his hand on the door. "I understand why it opens inward," he said. "It is not about the snow." She looked at him. "When people come in the dark," he said, "the door has to open toward them, not push them away." Nora looked at her grandson for a moment, at the serious set of his face, and the Silas dark of his eyes, and the jaw that was her own jaw. And she felt something move in her chest that she could not have named and did not try to. She put her hand against the cave wall. The rock was cool and steady, radiating its deep geological warmth from far below the reach of any season. She pressed her palm flat against it and held it there. The rock remembered summer. The rock held temperature. The rock did not care about the yellow sky or the betting pool at the saloon or the things that Amos Pruitt said from behind his counter, or the sermon that Reverend Jasper Wynne had preached the previous Sunday about women who rejected providence and trusted in holes in the ground. The rock was simply what it was, steady, patient, older than anything any of them could imagine. She kept her hand on the wall for a long time. The first wall held. The door was hung. The stove drew clean smoke up through the natural chimney in the rock. The sleeping room in the back kept its temperature without fire, 54 degrees on the coldest mornings they had seen so far. The main room warmed quickly when the stove was fed and held the heat for hours after the fire was banked. Nora counted her firewood. 459 logs, including the 47 that Clem had stacked during the 2 weeks her shoulder kept her off the scaffold. Each one measured and placed with the same care Silas had brought to his numbers. She stood one evening in the entrance of the finished cave and looked out at the valley below. The lights of Greystone were coming on in the early dark. She could hear faintly music from the direction of the saloon. Laughter. The sound of a place that believed tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. She looked at the sky. The yellow was at the edges of the sunset spreading inward, staining the light with a quality she had no other word for except sick. She had been watching it for weeks. It was stronger now. She went inside, barred the door against the night air, and sat by the cold stove with the Bible in her lap. She opened it to the back cover and took out the drawings and looked at them in the lamplight. Silas's handwriting shaking with the effort of each stroke, the numbers steady underneath it, for 50 bodies minimum. She had built for 50. She had built for more than 50 because when she stood in the wide open center of the main room and paced it out, she knew that more would come. More always came when the cold was bad enough. She put the drawings back in the Bible and set it on the shelf she had built along the east wall. She fed the stove. She checked the water barrels. She laid out the extra blankets in neat stacks in the sleeping room. She was ready. Now she could only wait for the night that was coming, the night she had been building toward. Since a man she loved had used the last of his strength to draw her away through it, November arrived in Greystone the way it always did, with a few days of genuine cold that made people pull their coats tighter and stack another cord of wood against the house and feel that particular satisfaction of having prepared adequately for what was coming. Then it softened again. The temperature climbed back to something manageable. People went about their business. The betting pool at the saloon was, by the first week of November, the most discussed ongoing wager in the history of Greystone. It had started with Ward Heston's $10 in June and had grown through the summer into something with its own momentum, a collection of small bets and opinions and predictions that had become less about Nora Callum specifically, and more about the general question of whether a person could be right about something that everyone else agreed was wrong. Most people in Greystone had decided the answer was no. Ward held court in his usual chair at Pruitt's most mornings, and the assessment he gave of Nora's project was consistent and confident, and delivered with the particular authority of a man who had been right about things in this valley for 23 consecutive years. He did not say she was a fool. He said she was grieving and that grief did things to a person's judgment, and that someone should really speak to her before she spent what was left of Silas Callum's modest savings on a hole in the ground that was going to sit empty all winter. This framing was important. It allowed everyone who agreed with him to feel that they were expressing concern rather than contempt. It was a kindness to doubt her. It was looking out for a widow woman who had clearly been affected by the loss of her husband and needed someone to talk some sense into her before she did any more damage to her family's financial situation. The only person in the saloon who never joined these conversations was Sheriff Birch Hadley. He had his coffee at the table by the window and he listened, and he did not offer his opinion. He was 40 years old and had worn the badge for 12 years, long enough to develop the kind of instincts that were not about any one specific thing, but about the general quality of a situation. Something had been humming in him since September, a low, persistent unease that he could not identify or explain. He had noticed the elk coming down early. He had noticed the color in the evening sky. He had ridden up the bluff road one Tuesday in October, before the door was hung, and stood in the entrance of the cave and felt the temperature change the moment he stepped inside. He had run his hand along the walls and noted the quality of the plaster, and looked at the firewood stacked in rows that went back further into the cave than he could count. He had looked at everything Nora had built, and he had gone home and added 2 extra cords of firewood to the stack against his office wall, without mentioning to anyone why he had done it. In the second week of November, Reverend Jasper Wynne delivered a sermon that the people of Greystone would discuss for years afterward. Though not for the reasons he intended, Reverend Wynne was 53 years old and had come to Greystone 6 years earlier from a church in Kansas City, and he had brought with him a confidence in his own spiritual authority that was not diminished by the fact that he had never been tested by anything harder than a difficult passage of Scripture. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had confused the sound of his own voice in a room with the voice of something larger and older than himself. He preached that Sunday morning about providence and preparation and the difference between the two. He talked about faith and about what it meant when a person chose to trust in earthly calculations rather than in the provision of the Almighty. He did not say Nora Callum's name from the pulpit. He did not need to. Everyone in the church knew who he was talking about. The woman who was building a house in a cave on the bluff road. The woman who seemed to believe that her own preparations were more reliable than God's care for his people. Miriam Heston sat in the third pew and nodded at intervals that conveyed her agreement with each successive point. The women around her took their cues from Miriam and nodded as well. Ward sat beside his wife with the satisfied expression of a man whose views were being endorsed from the highest available platform. Edna Morse sat in the back pew and looked out the window at the sky and said nothing. She was 72 years old, and she had heard sermons about providence before. She had heard them in the winter of 1856, and she had watched 11 people pray their way to death in frozen cabins, while 6 people who crawled into an abandoned mine shaft came out alive. She did not stand up and say this. She had learned long ago that people who had not survived a killing winter could not be told about one. They had to live through it, or they would never understand. She looked at the sky through the window, and she kept her counsel. The following Tuesday, Dr. Leonard Sykes rode up the bluff road. He was 55, thin as a fence post, with spectacles that seemed too large for his face, and a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania that he referenced in nearly every significant conversation he had. He was not a cruel man. He was a limited one, and he did not know it, which is the most dangerous variety of limitation there is. He dismounted at the cave entrance and called out and waited until Nora appeared from inside, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked at him without expression, the expression of a woman who had learned to receive visitors with something close to neutrality, because visitors rarely brought anything useful. He presented his concerns in the careful, measured tone of a man who had rehearsed this conversation. Caves were environments known to harbor dampness and poor air circulation. The particular respiratory conditions that had ended Silas Callum's life had been exacerbated by years of underground work and the conditions thereof. He would not want to see children placed in an environment that replicated those conditions. He was only thinking of her family. Nora let him finish. She had heard versions of this before. She understood that he believed what he was saying, that this was not mockery, but genuine concern filtered through an education that had never accounted for what she knew. That distinction was worth something. She told him that her husband had not died from the conditions of underground spaces. He had died from 4 days of breathing stone dust after a collapse with subsequent scarring of the lung tissue over years. She told him that the cave had natural ventilation through cracks in the rock ceiling, and that she had verified the air movement with a candle flame at every potential stagnation point. She told him that the temperature below the frost line held at 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, without any artificial heating, and that this was not her invention or her theory, but a physical property of the earth that could be verified by anyone willing to stand inside the cave with a thermometer. She met his eyes when she said it, not aggressively, simply steadily. My children will be healthier in that cave when the real cold comes than in any wooden cabin in this valley, she said. The kind of cold that kills does not care about good timber and tight roofing. I am not willing to bet their lives on hope. Sykes opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the cave entrance at the doorframe with its heavy oak at the stacks of firewood visible beyond it. He looked at the walls of the bluff at the natural rock windbreak that faced northwest at the morning sun that was even now reaching the cave entrance at the angle that Silas had noted in his drawings 19 years before he died. He rode away without another word. That night in his office, he sat with his diploma on the wall above his desk, and he tried to identify exactly what had made him feel for the first time in a long career that someone without his education understood something that he did not. He decided that whatever it was a feeling and not a fact, and he went to bed. He would remember that decision later. He would remember it when his office window exploded inward, and he found himself in a freezing ruin with his hands cut to the bone, and no one to help him, except the woman whose judgment he had questioned. The cave was finished by the end of October. Nora had plastered the last section of wall and stacked the final cord of firewood and laid out the blankets in the sleeping room, and checked the water barrels and gone over every detail in Silas's drawings one more time. The count was 459 logs. The main room was large enough to hold 50 people standing more if they pressed together. The stove drew cleanly through the chimney in the rock. The door was hung and the bar was fitted into its iron brackets, and the door opened inward just as the drawings specified. She stood in the finished cave on the last evening of October, and she felt the temperature on her skin steady and unhurried. The geological patience of 10,000 feet of rock, holding its warmth through 100 million winters indifferent to the particular concerns of the people who moved across its surface, like weather appearing and disappearing without leaving any permanent mark. She pressed her palm against the wall. She thought about the number at the bottom of Silas's drawing, for 50 bodies minimum. She had always taken that to mean a general preparedness, a margin of safety, a cushion against more need than expected. Standing in the finished cave, she thought about it differently. He had not written approximately 50, or perhaps 50. He had written minimum. He had been precise about minimum the same way he had been precise about everything else in those drawings. He had known. He had understood with the clarity of a man who was no longer capable of comfortable illusions that the winter coming would be worse than anything the town of Greystone had seen in living memory, and that the people of Greystone would be unprepared for it, and that they would come to wherever the light was when the dark got bad enough. He had built the margin for them, the extra space, the extra firewood, the extra food. He had calculated the need for people who did not yet know they were going to need anything. November deepened. The cold front that arrived on the 15th dropped the temperature to 15 below zero overnight without warning. Water buckets froze solid. Ice formed on the inside of windows thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. At the Heston Ranch, 3 cattle were found dead in the pasture the following morning, standing upright. Ice crystals in their open eyes, frozen too fast to lie down. Ward Heston looked at those 3 animals standing dead in his pasture, like statues of themselves. And he did not change his mind. He called it a bad week. He called it an early cold snap that would pass. He called it nothing to worry about. And he went back inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and waited for it to warm up again. It did warm up. In December, the temperature climbed back above freezing, and the snow that had accumulated began to melt. And people in Greystone breathed out and relaxed the tension they had been carrying since the November cold snap. Ward was right after all. It was going to be a mild winter. Everything was going to be fine. The betting pool at the saloon grew larger in December. The mild weather felt like vindication, like the general judgment of everyone who had laughed at Nora Callum all summer was now being endorsed by the weather itself. People who had been privately uncertain added their money. The total amount wagered on her failure had reached a number that would have seemed absurd in June. Nora watched the mild weather from the cave entrance each evening, and she felt the specific dread of someone who knows exactly what a false kindness looks like. She had read the paragraph in Silas's father's notes that described this pattern. The warm period before the killing cold. The false thaw that nature extended like an open hand before it closed into a fist. The particular cruelty of it was that it worked. It made people put down their preparations. It made them lower their guard at the exact moment they should have raised it. She checked the firewood count again. She checked the food stores. She went through the cave from the entrance to the back wall, examining every plaster joint, every piece of timber framing the seal around the stovepipe. The water barrels. She tested the door bar. She confirmed the ventilation flow with a candle held at the ceiling cracks. Everything held. Everything was ready. Everything was... One afternoon in early December, she was restacking a row of firewood that had settled unevenly when she heard footsteps on the bluff road and turned to find a young woman standing at the cave entrance. She was not someone Nora had expected. Dessa Pruitt was 23 years old, the daughter-in-law of Amos Pruitt, who had refused twice to sell Nora the materials she needed, and who had told her to her face that his conscience would not permit him to contribute to her foolishness. Dessa had married the Pruitt boy the previous spring, and she was 7 months along. Now the pregnancy visible under her winter coat, her face round and careful, in the way of women who are carrying more than they expected. She said she had not told anyone she was coming. She said she wanted to understand the drawings. Nora looked at her for a moment. She set down the log she was holding and she invited the girl inside. They sat at the small table near the stove, and Nora spread the drawings out on the table surface and went through them with the same patient exactness she had used when she sat with Clem during the 2 weeks of his grandfather's drawings. She explained the thermal properties of the rock. She explained the ventilation. She explained why the door opened inward and what that meant about the kind of night when people came to it. She explained the insulation in the walls, the clay and straw mixture that trapped still air in thousands of small pockets. The same principle as a down quilt, but made from earth instead of feathers. Dessa listened with the focused attention of a woman who was already thinking beyond what she was being told, to the specific ways she would apply it. She asked precise questions. She had her husband's family's aptitude for practical calculation, whatever that family had done to suppress it. Before she left, she touched the cave wall with one hand, the flat rock surface with its smooth plaster covering, and felt the steady, cool warmth of it. She asked if she could have a copy of the drawings. Nora made her a copy by lamplight that evening, going over each line, carefully transferring the measurements and angles with the same care Silas had used to create the originals. She pressed the copy into Dessa's hands the next morning when the girl came back before her father-in-law's store opened for the day. Neither of them mentioned Amos. Neither of them talked about what it meant that the man who had refused to sell nails to the woman who drew these plans was the same man whose daughter-in-law was carrying them home in her coat pocket. Some things did not need to be said. The saying would have complicated them in ways that the silence did not. In the second week of December, Reverend Wynne delivered another sermon on the theme of faith and worldly wisdom, and this time he was more specific. He talked about the folly of those who place their trust in human ingenuity above divine provision. He talked about the cave on the bluff road, though he called it a hole dug by grief, a monument to the failure of faith in a woman who had been so damaged by loss that she could no longer distinguish between reason and obsession. This was the first time he had described her not just as misguided, but as damaged. The congregation received it the way congregations receive things that articulate what they have already been thinking, with the particular satisfaction of judgment confirmed from a moral height. Edna Morse sat in the back pew and looked at her hands. She was the only person in the building who remembered what the winter of 1856 had looked like. She was the only person in the building who had huddled in an abandoned mine shaft for 11 days with 5 other people and come out alive, while 37 neighbors did not. She looked at her old hands, and she thought about the things that the earth held steady, and the things that the earth did not hold at all. And she said nothing because she had learned that you could not give a town its memory back by talking at it. She walked out of this church after the sermon without speaking to anyone, and she drove her buggy up the bluff road. Nora was outside at the woodpile splitting the last of the logs she had brought down from the ravine that week. She looked up when the buggy came around the bend, and she set the axe against the wall and waited. Edna Morse climbed down from the buggy with the careful movements of a woman whose joints had been filing complaints for 20 years. She stood in front of Nora and she looked at the cave entrance and the door and its heavy timber frame and the woodpile stacked tight under its overhang. "He preached against you again," she said. I heard Nora said, though she had not been in the church. News of that kind traveled fast in a small town. The old woman was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines below them. The sky to the northwest had that quality again, that sick yellow cast at the edges of the afternoon light that Nora had been watching for weeks. "I want to ask you something," Edna Morse said. "When it comes, and it is coming, and we both know it is coming when they knock on that door. All of them. Ward Heston and Amos Pruitt, and the reverend who called you damaged from his pulpit. What will you do?" Nora looked at the cave entrance. She looked at the door, 4 inches of oak, on iron hinges opening inward. "I will open it," she said. The old woman looked at her for a long moment. "Your husband was a lucky man," she said. "Not the luck of easy things, the other kind." She climbed back into her buggy and drove away down the road. Nora stood where she was for another minute in the cold afternoon air. Then she went back to the woodpile and picked up the axe. December moved toward Christmas with a warmth that was almost reassuring in the deliberate way that it was false. The temperature stayed above freezing. Children threw snowballs from the light snow that fell and melted before it could accumulate. The general store restocked its usual winter supplies and sold them at the usual pace. The boarding house filled up with travelers who had decided the passes were passable and the roads were clear enough to risk. Ward Heston said, at the saloon on the 22nd of December, that he had never felt better about a Colorado winter in his life. He said the mild weather was a gift, and that people who had spent the autumn panicking about nothing should take note. He looked comfortable in the way of a man whose long, unbroken record of being right was being extended by another entry. Amos Pruitt agreed. He had added $15 to the betting pool in November, and he considered those $15 well invested. Nora did not go into town in December. She had what she needed in the cave. She spent the final days of preparation the same way she had spent the previous 6 months, working through the checklist that Silas had written at the bottom margin of the third, drawing a list of items so comprehensive that she had been adding to it in her own hand since May. As she thought of things he had not included: medical supplies, needles and thread, the particular herbs she knew from her years of nursing that help with fever, and with breathing, and with the specific distress that came from people living too close together, under too much pressure for too many days. She laid the blankets out in order by size in the sleeping room. She organized the food stores by type and by date. She filled both water barrels from the stream below the bluff while the stream was still running, and she packed snow into the overflow containers against the possibility that the stream would freeze. On the evening of the 23rd, she sat at the table with the Bible open in front of her and the lamp turned low, and she looked at Silas's drawings one more time. She had looked at them so many times over the past 6 months that she knew them by memory. Every line, every measurement, every number. She turned the third drawing over. She had turned it over before dozens of times and seen nothing on the back but the texture of the paper and the faint impression of ink from the other side. But on this evening the lamp was positioned differently low and at an angle, and in that light she saw something she had not seen before. In the lower right corner of the back of the page, in writing so faint it might have been made with a nearly dry pencil, during a moment when the hand had very little left, there were numbers. Not the confident, precise numbers of the main drawings. These were different, smaller, more tentative, as though he had written them when he was not sure whether he was writing something real or only something he needed to write. She held the lamp close. They were dates, a range, December 24th to January 5th. He had known, not approximately, not generally. He had looked at the patterns his father had described, the early turning of the aspens, the elk moving down ahead of schedule, the yellow quality of light at the horizon in September and October, and he had calculated a window. He had done this while he was dying. He had done this while getting out of bed was an act of significant effort, and speaking in full sentences cost him minutes of recovery after each one. He had looked at the evidence and done the arithmetic and arrived at a window of 12 days, and the first day of that window was tomorrow. Nora sat with that knowledge for a long time in the quiet cave. The lamp burned steadily. Copper was asleep near the stove. Through the thick oak door came no sound at all. Nothing of the wind that had been picking up since afternoon. Nothing of the world outside. She thought about the distance between what a person knows and what a person does. Silas had known. He had known for months before he died that something was coming to this valley, that the valley was not prepared for. He had known it the way his grandfather had known the tin mines of Cornwall, and his father had known the silver mines of Colorado, not from books, from the long accumulated knowledge of people who had spent generations paying attention to what the earth was telling them, who had learned to read the signals that comfort and prosperity taught ordinary people to ignore. He had used that knowledge to build something. He had used it to leave something behind. She closed the Bible and set it on the shelf. She went to the sleeping room and looked at Clem and Retta sleeping in the steady, dark warmth of the deep cave. Clem was on his back now, not the defensive posture of the angry boy who had turned his face to the wall all summer. Retta had her hand on Copper, who had followed her as always. Their breathing was slow and deep, the breathing of people who were genuinely safe, which was something different from people who felt safe. Nora went back to the main room. She fed the stove 2 logs, bringing the fire up to the level she wanted for the night. She sat in the chair by the wall, and she looked at the door, at the bar and its iron brackets, at the 4 inches of oak that Clem had hung with his grandfather's instructions in his hands, opening inward, because that was what you built when you were planning for the night, when people came to you out of the dark. Outside, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sundown. By midnight, it had dropped 15 more. The wind that arrived from the northwest in the early hours of Christmas Eve was not the wind of an ordinary bad night. It was not the wind of a hard week or a cold snap that people would describe for a season and forget by spring. It was the kind of wind that came once in 20 years or 30 years. The kind that the old-timers talked about in the particular way soldiers talked about. Battles they had survived quietly without drama, with the specific respect of people who understood what it meant to face something that could not be negotiated with. It came at 60 miles an hour, and it came all at once, not building gradually, but arriving like a wall, like a freight train made of cold air that hit the valley at 3 in the morning and dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 2 hours and kept dropping. The sound of it was not the sound of ordinary wind. It was a sustained roar that filled the valley from ridge to ridge, that found every crack in every building in Greystone and drove cold through it like a blade finding a seam. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven so hard by the wind that it was indistinguishable from the wind itself, reducing visibility to nothing within minutes of the storm's arrival. In the cave on the bluff, Nora was awake before the storm fully arrived. She felt the pressure change in her sinuses and in the deep ache of her healed shoulder. An hour before the wind hit, and she was at the stove adding wood before the roar began. She felt the door in its frame and felt no movement. She listened to the seal of the plaster walls and heard no whistle of infiltrating air. She went to the sleeping room and put an extra blanket over each of the children. Without waking them, she sat in the chair by the stove with the lamp turned low, and she listened to Wyoming trying to get in. It could not get in. The walls held. The door held. The stove burned with the steady indifference of good iron doing its work. The temperature in the main room was 62 degrees. In the sleeping room, it would be 58. Outside, the thermometer she had mounted on the east face of the cliff read 30 below zero and was still falling. She thought about the people in Greystone, about the chimneys that were already beginning to ice over, about the wooden walls that were good enough for an ordinary Colorado winter and were not built for what was outside right now. She thought about Ward Heston in his ranch house and Amos Pruitt in his store and Reverend Wynne in his rectory and all the people who had been perfectly comfortable in December and had put down the preparations they might have made in October and November. She thought about Daniel Heston, 5 years old, who ran everywhere and laughed too loud and had never been seriously ill a day in his life. She fed the stove another log. She did not think about what was coming next in the way of anticipation. She thought about it in the way of readiness, which is a different thing entirely. Anticipation has a quality of waiting. Readiness has a quality of presence, of being exactly where you are, exactly as prepared as you are, with everything in order and nothing left to do, but be there when the moment arrives. The moment was arriving. She could feel it in the sound of the storm, in the particular pitch of the wind against the rock face, in the way the lamp flame held absolutely still in the sealed air of the cave, while outside the world was pure chaos. She pressed her hand against the wall. The rock was steady, cool and deep and steady. It had been holding this temperature through every winter this mountain had known through winters, before there were people to experience them through ice ages and thaws, and every season of violence and calm that the earth had produced in the millennia before anyone thought to drive a nail into timber, or mix clay with straw, or press a drawing flat against the back cover of a Bible and make a promise to keep it. Nora kept her hand on the wall for a long time. She thought about the number at the bottom of the drawing, for 50 bodies minimum. She had built for more than 50. She had built for more because she had known in the way you know things that are not susceptible to argument that more would come. That the space she had created in the center of the main room, wide and open and warm, was not empty space. It was space with a purpose that had not yet been fulfilled. She thought about Clem understanding why the door opened inward. She thought about Dessa Pruitt carrying the copy of the drawings home in her coat pocket. She thought about Edna Morse asking her what she would do when they came, all of them, Ward Heston and Amos Pruitt, and the Reverend who had called her damaged from his pulpit. She thought about the answer she had given. I will open it. The wind outside reached a pitch that was no longer a sound so much as a condition, a sustained physical presence that was simply the new reality of the world beyond the 4-inch oak door. The storm had fully arrived. It had been organizing itself over the mountains for weeks, while the people of Greystone told each other everything was fine. And now it was here, and it was not going to be brief, and it was not going to be mild. And every prediction Ward Heston had made from his chair in Pruitt's general store was going to be answered before this was over. Nora fed the stove. She checked the water barrels. She checked the bar on the door and confirmed it was seated in both brackets. Then she sat back down in the chair, and she listened, and she waited for the first sound that was different from the wind. The sound she knew was coming. The sound of a fist against 4 inches of oak. The sound of someone who had run out of other options. It did not come that first night. It came on Christmas morning. And when it came, she was already standing at the door. The fist against the door came at 6:30 on Christmas morning. Not a knock, a fist. The difference was audible even through 4 inches of oak and the sustained roar of the storm outside. A knock was a request. What Nora heard was something past the point of requests. The sound of a hand that had been cold long enough to stop feeling pain beating against wood, because wood was the only thing left to beat against. She was already at the door. She had been sitting in the chair by the stove since 3 in the morning when the storm arrived fully. Not sleeping, not anxious. Simply present the way you were present when something you had been preparing for was finally here. She had fed the stove every hour. She had kept the lamp at the level where it threw enough light to work by. She had gone twice to the sleeping room to check the children, and found them both undisturbed by the storm in the way of people sleeping in a space where the noise of the world outside could not reach. When the fist hit this door, she was across the room in 4 steps, with her hand on the bar. She lifted it. The door swung inward, and the cold came with it, a wall of air, so far below zero that it had a physical weight pressing against her face and hands, like something solid. The lamp flame lurched sideways. She held the door against the wind that was trying to tear it from her grip. Ward Heston fell through the opening. He went down on one knee on the cave floor, and Daniel came off his back. And Nora caught the boy before he hit the stone, one arm under the small body. The movement automatic, and practiced the movement of a woman who had spent years as a nurse, knowing how to receive a person who could not hold themselves up. She had Daniel in her arms before Ward fully understood she was there. She turned to the doorway. Sheriff Birch Hadley was there, and behind him Miriam Heston, and behind her 3 more children. smaller, moving in the stumbling way of people whose bodies had been making decisions that their minds were no longer fully in charge of. Hadley had his arm around the smallest of the Heston children, a girl not yet 4 years old, her face a white mask with two dark eyes looking out of it. Nora stepped back from the door and jerked her head toward the interior. "Get in," she said. "All of you." She pushed the door shut behind the last child and dropped the bar and turned to the room. Daniel was in her arms, and she could feel through the blankets wrapped around him that his temperature was wrong. Too cool at the extremities, the hands and feet, and the small face carrying the specific cold of tissue that had been losing heat for too long. His breathing was shallow, and his lips were the deep bluish purple that belonged to no healthy shade of living. She carried him to the spot near the stove she had identified in October as the right distance for slow warming, close enough to receive the radiant heat, but not so close that the temperature differential would shock a system already in distress. Too fast was as dangerous as too slow. She had known this as a nurse, and she had thought about it specifically because she had known that when people arrived, they would arrive cold and would need to be warmed with care. She laid Daniel down. She elevated his feet. She covered him with layers starting from the core outward. Retta appeared from the sleeping room without being asked. She was 9 years old, and she had the particular competence of a child who has been paying attention to everything her grandmother did for 6 months and has quietly absorbed the purpose of each preparation. She carried a kettle that had been sitting on the back of the stove through the night, the water inside it warm but not hot. Exactly the temperature Nora had told her was the right temperature for warming someone who had been cold too long. She carried it the way she carried everything, steadily, without drama, with the copper-colored dog at her heels. Retta poured warm water into a cloth and folded it and pressed it gently against the back of Daniel's neck without being told. She had seen her grandmother practice this. She had asked questions about it and received answers, and she had understood the answers. Nora looked at her granddaughter for exactly 1 second, and then she moved on to the next thing, because the next thing was already needed. Miriam Heston was on the floor against the wall with the 4-year-old pressed against her chest, both of them shaking in the deep, involuntary shudder of bodies asserting themselves against cold. The older Heston children stood in a cluster near the door, white-faced and rigid, their eyes moving around the cave with the slow, unfocused quality of people whose minds had not yet caught up with where their bodies were. Clem came from the back of the cave, carrying blankets stacked to his chin. He was 14 years old, and he did not smirk at the Heston children, some of whom had laughed at him in the schoolyard all summer. He did not say anything at all. He wrapped each child in a blanket, starting with the smallest and working upward by size. And when he reached the oldest boy, a boy who had called his grandmother a fool to his face in August, he wrapped that boy in a blanket too, with the same steady hands and the same absence of comment. He did it because it was what needed doing. He did it because his grandfather had planned for this moment, and he understood now what the plan was for. Ward Heston was on one knee in the center of the cave. Steam was rising from his coat. Water was running from his hair and beard where the ice was melting. His hands were laid flat on his thighs, and they were the color of old bone white past the wrist, and he was looking at them as though they belonged to someone else, and he was not yet sure what to do about that. He had been a large man in this valley for 23 years. He had been the man with the answers, the man whose certainty organized the room around him, wherever he stood. He was still large. The certainty was gone. What remained was a father whose son was lying on a blanket near a stove in a cave he had laughed at for 6 months. And the distance between those two facts was the longest distance he had ever traveled. Nora did not speak to him. She was moving between Daniel and the Heston children, and Hadley, who had taken off his outer coat and was already pulling ice from the hem, his face showing the tight, controlled expression of a man who had spent several hours in conditions that had cost him something and was not yet ready to calculate the full price. She brought broth first. She had put a pot of dried bean soup on the back of the stove the previous evening, knowing it would be needed, and it had been sitting there through the night and into the morning, warm and thick. The kind of food that entered a cold body and began changing things from the inside. She ladled it into tin cups and distributed them by need, the children first, then Miriam, then Hadley. She handed a cup to Ward Heston. He took it with his bone-white hands and looked up at her. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she went back to Daniel. The boy's color was changing. Slowly, the way dawn changed the sky, not all at once, but by degrees that were individually almost imperceptible and collectively undeniable. The deep purple of his lips was moving through stages towards something that was almost the right color of living. His breathing was deeper than it had been 10 minutes ago. His hands were beginning to feel different. Under the cloth that Nora pressed to them, less like cold stone and more like something that had a future. He opened his eyes at 7:30. He looked at the ceiling of the cave. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the small girl with copper-colored hair kneeling beside him, pressing a warm cloth to his neck, who looked back at him with the grave attention of someone fulfilling an important task. He said one word. "Mama." Miriam Heston crossed the cave in 3 steps. She went to her knees beside her son, and she gathered him into her arms with a force that contained every prayer she had said in the past 90 minutes, and every fear she had carried through the blizzard and every version of the future she had tried not to imagine during the mile through the snow, with her husband's voice coming back to her in gusts each time the wind dropped briefly below, screaming. "I am here," she said. "We are safe." She held her son, and she wept without restraint, and the sound of it in the cave was the sound of something that had been held very tight for a long time, releasing all at once. Ward Heston stood in the center of the room and watched Nora Callum move on to the next thing that needed doing before the last thing was fully finished, already checking the older children's fingers and toes with the same methodical attention she had given to Daniel, looking for the white, waxy patches that meant the cold had gone past, superficial and into tissue. She found some. She dealt with them the same way warm cloths, gradual rewarming the specific calm of a person who has thought through every contingency and prepared for it and is now simply executing the preparation. She had not looked at him again after handing him the cup of broth. Not with triumph, not with reproach, not with anything. She simply had too much to do to spend attention on what he had said and thought and believed for the past 6 months. He drank his broth. He stood there in the warmth of the cave with the cup in his hands, and he tried to find the words for what he owed this woman, and he could not find them because they did not exist. The storm did not relent on Christmas Day. It deepened through the afternoon into something that Birch Hadley had never experienced in 12 years of wearing a badge in Colorado weather. A sustained assault that removed the concept of outside as a place where human beings could exist and replaced it with a howling white wall that the door held back, and nothing else. Hadley went out 3 times that day. Each time he came back with people. He found the Kellerman family huddled in their front room with a fire that had been guttering for hours, the chimney iced solid, the children wrapped in every blanket in the house. He brought them through the storm in 2 trips. The smaller children carried the older ones, moving between the adults. He found old Marcus Webb alone in his house with the cold already in his chest, his breathing the particular rattling sound that Nora recognized and responded to immediately. positioning him near the stove and keeping him there. He found the family from the boarding house whose roof had developed a crack in the night and was admitting the cold in a steady stream that no amount of stuffing and patching could stop. Each time Hadley came back, he stood in the cave doorway for a few seconds longer before going back out, gathering himself, letting the warmth work on him briefly, before turning back into the roar. His face was losing its careful, controlled expression by degrees and replacing it with something rawer, something that was simply the face of a man doing what needed doing and paying the price of it without complaint. Nora watched him and said nothing and made sure his broth was hot when he came in. By nightfall on Christmas Day, there were 31 people in the cave. By the morning of the 26th, there were 47. The space that Silas had calculated for 50 bodies minimum was filling toward its design capacity, and Nora moved through the logistics of it with the systematic attention of a woman who had spent months planning for exactly this, adjusting the spacing, relocating the sick to the warmest positions, redistributing the blankets as the count rose. She rationed the firewood, 2 logs per hour, not 1.5 and not 3. The count she had been maintaining in her head since May now ran in the background of everything else she was doing, updating constantly as she tracked the burn rate against the supply. At 2 logs per hour, they had enough to burn for 2 weeks. She intended to keep it at 2 logs per hour, and she intended that no one would add wood to the stove without her accounting for it. She rationed the food the same way. The dried beans and the salted meat and the flour became a thin soup that she stretched across every meal, filling stomachs, without emptying stores, calibrating the portions with the same precision Silas had brought to the measurements in his drawings. People did not go hungry. People did not have enough to feel comfortable. Those were different things, and she understood the difference and held the line between them without apology. On the 27th, Hadley brought in 12 more people, and among them was Dr. Leonard Sykes. He had lost his office window to the cold on Christmas night. The glass had exploded inward under the pressure of the temperature, differential showering the examination room with shards. And in the freezing ruin of what had been his professional space, he had tried to board the opening while the cold poured through it, and he had cut both hands deeply on the glass, doing it. The cuts were not healing the way cuts needed to heal, because the cold was working against everything that the body did to repair itself. And by the time Hadley found him, he was sitting in the corner of his examination room with his hands wrapped in bandages that had soaked through, and his face the particular gray of a man who has been losing the argument with the situation for longer than he would ever admit. Nora guided him to a position near the stove, and she took his hands and unwrapped the bandages with steady fingers. The wounds were deep, and the cold had done things to them that made the work of cleaning and rebinding more complicated than it would have been in a warm room with proper light. She worked with what she had: whiskey for cleaning the clean cloth she had set aside for this purpose, needle and thread for the worst of the cuts on the left palm. Sykes did not look at her while she worked. He looked at the cave wall behind her. Then he looked at the people around him. 30 people who had not been in the cave when he had last seen it. In October, people who were warm and provisioned and breathing clean air in the steady 60-degree warmth of a space that a 64-year-old woman with arthritic hands had built from the ground up, using the knowledge of a dead man who had loved her. He looked at all of this, and he looked at his hands in hers, and he said, "I was wrong about everything." She was tying off the thread on the last suture. She finished the knot and snipped the thread, and then she looked at him. She said, "Drink something hot. Then sleep." Not because she was dismissing what he had said, because what he had said was true, and she had known it was true for months, and there was nothing either of them needed to add to it right now. The work of his being wrong and her being right had already been done. It was in the walls around them, and in the 30 people breathing warm air, and in the child who was sleeping in the back room with color in his lips again. She handed him a cup, and she moved on to the next thing. By the 28th of December, there were 61 people in the cave. The space that Silas had designed was holding them with room still left in the center of the main chamber. That wide open space that Nora had deliberately not filled with furniture or storage. The space that had no purpose that she could have explained in May, and that now revealed its purpose every time Hadley came through the door, with another family shaking off the cold and needing somewhere to stand. Reverend Jasper Wynne arrived on the 29th. Hadley found him face down in a drift 200 yards from the cave entrance, which meant he had been within 200 yards of safety for some portion of the 12 hours he had apparently been wandering in the blizzard since the church roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow on the night of the 28th. The collapse had happened around midnight. The Reverend had been sleeping in the rectory attached to the back of the church, and the sound of the timbers going had woken him in time to get out through a window. His wife and children had reached the cave 2 days earlier, brought by Hadley on the 27th. The Reverend had refused to leave the church. He had knelt at the altar and prayed for the storm to stop, certain that his faith was a sufficient shield against whatever the weather intended. The weather had intended the roof. Hadley carried him through the door and laid him near the stove, and Nora was there immediately assessing with the practiced speed of someone who had learned to read a body's condition, the way Silas had learned to read rock formations, looking for the signs that told her which problem was most urgent. The feet were the problem, the right foot particularly. The cold had been at it for too long, and what she found when she carefully removed the boot was the blackened discoloration that told its own story clearly and without any need for interpretation. She looked at Sykes across the room. He was sitting up now, his hands bandaged, his face restored to something closer to its usual color. She met his eyes, and she held his gaze, and she conveyed what she needed him to understand without saying the words in the hearing of a room that contained the man's wife and children. Sykes got up and came to where she was kneeling, and he examined the foot with his bandaged hands, moving carefully. And then he looked at her and confirmed what she already knew. He said the left foot can likely be saved entirely. The right. He paused. He will lose toes, possibly more. Reverend Wynne was conscious. His eyes were open and looking at the ceiling, and his lips were moving in the way of a man in prayer, or in the preliminary stages of shock. He heard what Sykes said. His eyes moved from the ceiling to the cave wall, and then they found Nora. She was still kneeling beside him. Her hands were wrapped in their strips of cloth, and her silver hair was pulled back, and her face showed nothing that could be called triumph or satisfaction. Nothing of the 6 months of sermons and whispers, and the morning she had stood in his church and heard herself described as a damaged woman who had confused obsession with reason. His wife appeared from the back of the cave and went to her knees on the other side of him. She took his hand. He looked at Nora and his mouth worked, and then he said the thing that was on it without ornamentation or preamble. "I preached against you from the pulpit," he said. "I stood in the house of God and called you broken." She held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not soften it. "Yes," she said, "you did." She paused for one breath. "But you are here now. That is what matters." She stood and she went to check the firewood count, because the stove needed tending and there were 62 people in the cave, counting Reverend Wynne, and 62 people produced more body heat than 48 had, and she needed to adjust the burn rate accordingly. He lay on the stone floor of the cave with tears running into his ears, and his wife's hand in his, and the warmth of 62 bodies around him. And what he felt in that moment was not the theological variety of humility that he had dispensed from the pulpit for 6 years. It was the other kind. The kind that had a physical weight to it. The kind that came from losing 2 toes to your own certainty and finding yourself saved by the woman you had publicly condemned. Those 2 kinds of humility have nothing in common except the name. On the night of the 30th of December, 81, people were sheltered in the cave on the Bluff Road, and the storm was in its 7th day, with no sign of the diminishment that everyone in the cave was trying not to hope for too loudly, because hope was the thing that hurt most when it was wrong. Nora was managing 81 people with the focused precision of a woman who had been carrying the weight of large logistics for 6 months, and had learned that the carrying was simply what you did. One calculation at a time. One decision at a time. One log added to the stove at the right moment, rather than 3 logs added because someone was cold and afraid, and the restraint of 2 was harder than the ease of 3. She was at the back of the cave, checking the water supply, when she heard a sound from the sleeping room that she had not heard before in 7 days of the storm. She knew what it was before she reached the doorway. Dessa Pruitt was 23 years old, and she had come to the cave 2 days earlier with her husband and his mother, and the knowledge she had been carrying in her coat pocket since early December. She was 8 weeks from her due date, and she had told no one this because the information would have added to the concern of a room that was already at the upper limit of what it could productively concern itself with. She had been managing it with the particular discipline of a young woman who had learned from a 64-year-old widow that management was something you did rather than something you announced. Her labor had started in the night. She had not called out. She had been breathing through it in the sleeping room since before midnight, counting the intervals, doing the arithmetic of timing that she had read about in the pages of the medical guide Nora kept on the cave shelf. She had gotten through 8 hours of early labor without waking anyone around her. When the intervals shortened to the point where the arithmetic left no room for doubt, she said one word. She said, "Mrs. Callum." Nora was in the room in 6 steps. She looked at Dessa, and she looked at the timing, and she looked at what her hands told her in the brief examination, and she made the calculation that Dessa had already made, and she straightened up and she began to move. She cleared the sleeping room. She sent Clem to bring the kit she had prepared in October, the one on the 3rd shelf of the east wall, wrapped in clean cloth. She put water on the stove. She pulled the lamp to the position that gave the best light, and she sat beside Dessa, and she put her hand over the girl's hand, and she said something in a voice too low for anyone outside the room to hear. She said, "Your baby is coming early, but not too early. I have done this before. You are going to do this. I will be here the entire time." Dessa looked at her. She said, "I am not afraid." Whether she meant it fully in that moment is something only she could have said. But she said it, and she kept saying it in the way that counts, which is through the hours that followed, and the work that those hours required. Saying it not in words, but in the particular steadiness of a woman who had been paying attention, and had prepared as well as preparation was possible. In the main room of the cave, 80 people sat in the knowledge of what was happening behind the partition. Some prayed. Some simply sat in the quality of silence that descends on a group of people who are experiencing something together that none of them have words for yet. Children who had been restless for 7 days sat still. Men who had not spoken to each other in hours found themselves shoulder to shoulder, in a way that was neither accidental nor deliberate, but simply what bodies did when they were all paying attention to the same thing. The storm went on outside, It had been going on for 7 days, and it did not pause for what was happening inside the cave any more than it paused for anything else. Clem sat near the stove and fed it at the correct intervals and counted the logs in his head, the way his grandmother had taught him, and kept the temperature where it needed to be. He was 14 years old, and he had the gravity of a person twice his age. Not the gravity of sadness, but the gravity of someone who understood what was at stake and was holding up their portion of it. Retta sat beside him with Copper, and she did not talk the way she usually talked. She watched the partition to the sleeping room, and she kept her hand on the dog. The labor lasted 7 hours. At 4 in the morning on New Year's Eve, a sound came from the sleeping room that was the oldest sound in the world, and the newest and the most impossible in the circumstances, and the most inevitable given everything that had been built and prepared and promised. The first cry of a baby drawing its first breath, thin and high and insistent and completely indifferent to blizzards and caves and the 8 days of storm, and the 80 people sitting on the other side of a partition listening to it with their breath held. The held breath released. It released across 80 people simultaneously. The same exhalation, the same unwinding of something that had been pulled tight for a very long time, and the sound of it was not loud, but it was unmistakable. The sound of a room full of human beings coming back to themselves. An old man near the east wall, who had not spoken in 3 days, said, "Thank God," in a voice that shook. And he meant it in the way that you only mean it when you have arrived at the far side of something you were not sure you would survive. Nora emerged from the sleeping room 6 minutes later. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hands showed the evidence of the work, and her face showed the exhaustion of a woman who had been carrying 81 lives for 8 days, and had just added one more. Her eyes were bright. "A girl," she said. "Mother and baby are both alive." She said it to the room the way you said the only thing that needed to be said, without addition or ornamentation, because the sentence itself contained everything. The room did what rooms did with a sentence like that. Some people wept. Some people reached for the person nearest them. Children who were too young to fully understand felt the shift in the adults around them and relaxed into it. Ward Heston put his face in his hands. Miriam pressed her fist against her mouth and looked at the ceiling. Nora turned to go back to Dessa and the child. She heard a voice behind her say her name. She turned. Dessa Pruitt was holding her daughter in the dim light of the sleeping room, the baby's face visible over the edge of the blanket. Eyes closed, the small features concentrated in the absolute self-possession of the newly born. Dessa was looking at Nora with the expression of a woman who had something important to say, and knew that this was the correct moment to say it. She said, "I want to name her Grace. Grace Nora." Nora stood in the doorway. She had held herself together for 8 days. She had rationed firewood and food and water and her own internal resources with the same precision she had brought to every other number in Silas's drawings. She had not cried when Dr. Sykes admitted his mistake. She had not cried when Reverend Wynne said the words from the pulpit that would follow him for the rest of his life. She had not cried when Daniel opened his eyes and said, "Mama." She turned away from the doorway briefly. When she turned back, she had done what she needed to do. She walked to Dessa, and she sat beside her, and she looked at the baby named Grace Nora, and she said nothing at all, because there was nothing that words could add to what that name meant, to what this baby meant. Born in the cave that Silas had designed with his dying hands. Born to the daughter-in-law of the man who had twice refused to sell materials for its construction named for the woman who had built it anyway. She sat there for a few minutes, and then she went back to the stove because the fire still needed tending and the storm was not finished yet. The storm broke on January 4th. It did not announce its ending any more than it had announced its beginning. The roar that had been the constant condition of the world for 11 days simply diminished, dropped from a scream to a moan, to a silence so complete that the people in the cave heard it as a sound of its own, the sound of something large and violent departing. Birch Hadley opened the door first, the cold air that came in was 12 below zero. After 11 days of 30 and 40 below 12 below, felt like something that could be negotiated with. It felt like winter rather than the end of the world. He stepped outside and looked at what remained of Greystone. Half the roofs in town had collapsed under the accumulated snow. The church steeple was gone. The general store had lost its front wall. The boarding house was buried to its second-story windows. The world was white and flat and silent in the way of a place that had been through something it was still coming to terms with. 3 graves would be dug when the snow was movable. 3 people who had not reached the cave in time. 3 out of 300. In the winter of 1856, the number had been 37. That difference was 11 days of preparation by one woman who had kept a promise. Nora stood in the cave entrance in the clear, cold air and looked at the valley below. She could feel the sun on her face for the first time in 11 days, and it felt like something being returned that she had not expected to get back. Clem stood on her left. Retta stood on her right with Copper between her feet. In the sleeping room behind them, Dessa Pruitt was nursing a baby named Grace Nora. She pressed her hand against the rock wall of the cliff beside the entrance, cool and steady. Patient as it had always been, the days that followed were the work of beginning again. People left the cave in groups as the snow compacted and the roads became passable, returning to their homes or to what remained of them, carrying with them the particular altered quality of people who have been through something together that they will be processing for the rest of their lives. Ward Heston was the last to leave before his family standing in the cave entrance on the morning of January 6th. He had been helping with the work of the cave for 3 days, by then cutting firewood under Clem's direction, carrying water, doing the physical labor that his large frame was suited for, without waiting to be asked. He stood in the entrance and looked at Nora, and he opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. She looked at him. She said, "Go home, Ward. You have a ranch to rebuild and a boy who wants his father." He nodded once. He turned and walked down the bluff road through the snow. He would return in March with 30 men and 3 months of labor, and he would rebuild every structure in Greystone that the storm had taken, starting with the homes that had been most damaged and working outward. This was not something he announced. It was something he did. On the 10th of February, the town of Greystone held a meeting in the hastily repaired saloon. Every adult in the valley was present. Nora sat near the back with Clem on one side and the Bible on the table in front of her. Copper was at her feet. Ward Heston stood first. His frostbitten hands were still bandaged at the fingertips. He was a large man, and he stood the way large men stood when they were carrying something heavy carefully, without hurrying. He told the room what he had said about Nora Callum. Not a summary. The specific words as close to exact as his memory could retrieve them. He told them about June and July, and the betting pool, and the things he had said in Pruitt's store, and at the saloon and at his own table at home. He told them about the morning his son was dying, and the mile through the blizzard, and the moment he fell in the snow, and did not know if he was going to be able to get back up. Then he said the only reason any of us is breathing right now is because that woman opened her door to the people who laughed at her for 6 months. His voice broke on the word breathing. It broke the way wood broke along the grain cleanly at a point of genuine weakness, and he did not try to hide it. He sat down. Amos Pruitt stood. He was a smaller man than Ward, and the smallness seemed more pronounced than usual. Not a physical thing, but a quality of presence. He said that he had refused twice to sell Nora the materials she needed. He said he had told her it was for her own good, and that he had slept well afterward in the certainty of having done the right thing. He said that his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter were alive because of the woman he had turned away from his counter. He could not finish the sentence after that. He sat down without finishing it. Dr. Sykes stood and held out his scarred hands, where the room could see them. He said that his medical education had led him to question the judgment of a woman who understood something his textbooks had never addressed, and that the scar tissue on his palms was the record of that error, which he intended to keep visible for the rest of his career, as a reminder that knowledge and wisdom were not the same thing. Reverend Wynne rose with his crutch. He moved slowly. He would move slowly for the rest of his life. He said that he had used the authority of the pulpit to tell the people of Greystone that a woman who trusted the earth over the Lord was a damaged woman with disordered faith. He said that he had kneeled at his altar on Christmas night and prayed for a storm to stop, and the storm had taken his church roof and left him wandering in the dark. He said that the woman he had condemned had saved his life and the lives of his wife and children. He looked at Nora directly when he said the last part. He said that he would never again preach as though the voice in his own chest and the voice of God were the same voice, that he had confused the two for too long, that the difference between them was something he had learned at a cost he did not think he had paid completely yet, and that the learning of it would continue for as long as he lived. The room was quiet for a moment after he sat down. Nora stood. She had not planned what she was going to say. She had not needed to plan it because it had been clear to her for months, the way certain things were clear that required no rehearsal, because they were simply true, and the saying of them was only a matter of finding the moment. She looked at the room. She looked at every face she had come to know over 11 days in the cave, every face that had been afraid and cold and humbled and human, every face that had revealed itself under pressure as the face it actually was, rather than the face it presented when things were comfortable. She said, "I did not build that cave to be right. I built it because my husband asked me to, because he knew what winter could do to a valley that had forgotten to be afraid of it, and he wanted to make sure that when it came, there was somewhere to go. Every log I stacked and every wall I plastered was a conversation with a man who was not there anymore. That is all it was. A woman keeping a promise." She paused. The room was very still. She said, "But if you want to make this mean something going forward, here is what I need from you. Not your apologies. I heard them and I received them, and they are done. What I need is your attention. The next time someone does something you do not understand, do not laugh. Ask why. Listen to the answer. And if they need help, give it." She picked up the Bible from the table. She said, "My husband drew these plans with hands that were shaking. He used what was left of him to make sure that people he would never meet would have somewhere to go when the worst came. He calculated for 50 bodies minimum, and we sheltered 84. He knew us better than we knew ourselves." She put the Bible back down. She said, "Let us make sure that his knowing was not wasted." She sat. Spring came to Greystone the way spring always came to Colorado. Mountain valleys, tentatively at first, with cold mornings and warm afternoons, and the slow, persistent work of the sun on the accumulated snow, until the creeks ran high and the south-facing slopes appeared through the white in patches that grew larger each day. Work crews organized by Ward Heston rebuilt the structures the storm had taken. The plans from Silas's drawings were copied and distributed to every family in the valley. The thermal principles explained in the practical language of people who worked with their hands and understood what the earth held stable and what it did not. Cellars were dug below the frost line. Walls were reinforced. Chimneys were rebuilt with the secondary flues that Silas had described in his notes. The redundant path for smoke that would not ice over, under the conditions that had sealed every chimney in Greystone on Christmas Eve. Amos Pruitt rebuilt his general store with a cellar that could shelter 20 people, and a firewood supply that he maintained at the level Silas had specified in the drawings, calculated for a winter worse than the one that had just passed. He did not make a public announcement about this. He simply did it. Dr. Sykes spent the spring documenting everything in a series of leather-bound journals that he would add to for decades. He measured the cave temperature at regular intervals and recorded the measurements with the meticulous care of a man who had come to understand that the data mattered in a way his previous career had not prepared him to appreciate. He recorded 54 degrees Fahrenheit below the frost line consistent year-round, regardless of the conditions on the surface above. He wrote in the first journal the Callum family possessed in practical form, an understanding of thermal mass and subsurface temperature stability that formal science is only beginning to articulate. This knowledge was transmitted through 3 generations of Cornwall mining families and preserved through the act of a woman keeping a promise to her dying husband. It saved 84 lives. It deserves to be known. Dessa Pruitt came to the cave in April with Grace Nora, who was 3 months old and had the particular vitality of a child who had arrived early and had been making up for it ever since. She sat at the small table where Nora had spread the drawings for her the previous December, and she asked the questions she had been accumulating since the night she watched her daughter born in lamplight while a blizzard tried to get through 4 inches of oak and failed. She became the person who knew the cave better than anyone except Nora herself. She learned the maintenance of the walls, the checking of the ventilation, the seasonal adjustments to the firewood storage. She brought her husband, and she taught him. She brought her father-in-law, and she taught him. Amos Pruitt stood in the cave where his granddaughter had been born, and he put his hand on the wall, and he felt the temperature that Silas Callum had built for, and he did not say anything for a long time. On the hill above the valley where Silas was buried, a stone was added that spring. Not to his grave, but beside it a flat piece of granite that Clem shaped and set himself with the skill of a boy who had been paying close attention for a year to the way stone behaved when you worked with it, rather than against it. He carved the words from the bottom of his grandfather's last drawing. For 50 bodies minimum, nothing else. The words needed nothing else. Nora stood at the grave on the morning the stone was set, and she put her hand on the flat granite, and she felt the sun on it warm, in the way that early spring sun was warm, tentative and promising the beginning of the warmth that the earth would spend all summer absorbing and all winter releasing. She looked at the valley below, at the town that was being rebuilt, at the cave entrance visible from the hill, the timber frame of its door, the walls of stone above it. She looked at Clem standing on her left and Retta on her right with copper between them, and she thought about the number on the drawing. He had calculated for 50. She had sheltered 84. A baby had been born. The baby carried her name. She put her palm flat against the stone where the words were carved. She pressed it there for a long time in the warm morning sun. She thought about the last night before the storm, sitting alone in the cave, with the lamp low and the Bible open to the back cover, and the drawings spread on the table, and the date range in the lower corner in writing so faint it was barely legible, the writing of a man who had done the calculation at the end of everything. He had known within 3 days. He had died knowing it, and had left her the knowledge and had trusted her to do what the knowledge required. She had done it. The promise she had made in October, in a room with his hand in hers, and his eyes on hers. And the silence that followed the last breath had been kept through 6 months of labor, and 11 days of a storm that the old-timers would describe for the rest of their lives, in the particular quiet voice of people paying respect to something that had earned it. She had kept it in the walls of the cave, and in the 4 inches of oak that opened inward, and in the 2 logs per hour, and in the cup of broth handed to a man who had laughed at her, and in the hands that had caught Daniel Heston before he hit the floor, and in the hours beside Dessa Pruitt, and in the words she had said to Reverend Wynne from her knees that had cost her something, and had been true anyway. She stood on the hill in the spring sun with her hand on the carved stone, and she felt the particular peace of a person who has done the thing they promised to do and knows it was worth every price. Below the valley, the creek was running high with snowmelt. The aspens that had turned gold 2 weeks early the previous September were putting out their first pale green leaves. A hawk made a long, slow circle in the clear air above the bluff where the cave was. Clem said nothing. Retta said nothing. Copper stood at their feet and his tail moved slowly. They stayed until the sun had moved enough to change the quality of the light on the stone. And then Nora lifted her hand and turned, and they walked back down the hill together. The 3 of them and the dog into the valley that Silas Callum had loved and planned for, and left them to tend. The work was not finished. The work would never be finished. New families would come to the valley who had not been there for the storm, and would need to learn what the earth held stable. New winters would come, not all of them killing winters, but some of them, and the preparation for the worst had to be maintained whether the worst arrived or not. Nora understood this the same way she understood the firewood count, and the thermal properties of clay, and the difference between a door that opened inward and one that opened out. You built for what was coming, not for what you hoped was coming. You kept the promise even when no one was watching and no one was thanking you. And the people who should have been helping were laughing. You kept it because it was the thing you had said you would do, and because someone had spent the last of themselves trusting you to do it. That was what love looked like when it had work to do. It looked like walls built by hands that hurt. It looked like a door hung by a 14-year-old boy who had finally understood his grandfather. It looked like a cup of broth given without comment to a man who had spent 6 months betting on your failure. It looked like a baby named for you born in the shelter you had built alive in the world that would not have had her if you had not kept your word. Nora walked down the hill with the spring sun on her face and the sound of the creek rising and the knowledge that the cave was ready for whatever came next. She had always known it would be. Silas had known it too.